What about tight muscles, tight hamstrings and tight hips? We hear that often, tight psoas. This is really pulling on your back. This is causing you, this back dysfunction and things like that. Is there some truth to some of that?
Well, first of all, if I'm a high jumper, I want tight hamstrings. Now the question is, do I need that mitigated to manage back pain? And it may or may not be. If we start out on a neurological level to begin the answer, or not the answer, I'm not giving answers, I'm giving discussions. If we were to start a discussion about that, pain corrupts engrams. Pain corrupts muscle memory. If you need proof, I would, when I was a professor, I would take a kid off the stage and put him behind and I'd stick a bolt in his shoe, or I'd take a bandage and bandage up his hip or something, and then put his pants back on and, get him to walk across the stage at the front of the lecture hall. And everyone in there had to guess what was going on with this person because of their outward corrupted pattern. So pain corrupts. It causes you to limp. Years ago, have you heard of Wladimir Janda, the great Czechoslovakian neurologist, and crossed pelvis syndrome and things like this?
I have not.
Okay. What Janda proposed, and this was before he had the technology to prove it, he proposed through clinical observation that people with hip pain and back pain get, he would call weak glutes and tight hip flexors. So I believe we were the first to measure this. Is it true? Well, not in everybody with back pain and hip pain, but certainly there were some that when you give them back pain and hip pain, they don't use their gluteals as much anymore for hip extension. They become hamstring dominant. Now, again, you will see this in lifters. They get sore backs, and what do? They forget they own a pair of glutes, and they go right to their hamstrings, and now they've lost half of their motors. And they're wondering, well, shoot, they start overusing their back, and now they're right back to back pain. And what was the solution? It was to wake up or bring back the gluteals into that pain-corrupted muscle memory or motor pattern. Now, let's go to the other side of the joint. Less common was the facilitated hip flexors. But when we measured it, it wasn't the hip flexors. It was psoas. It was only psoas. So when you look at the architecture of the hip flexors, so we have the ball on the femur side and the socket on the pelvis side. The iliacus connects the front of the femur and the inside bowl, if you will, of the ilium. So it's just a uniarticular muscle. So if the iliacus flexes the hip, it bends the femur, but it also on the proximal side bends the pelvis through that uniarticular joint. It's like doing a bench press. If all I had was pec, I would get the desired action of flexing my arm, but I would also bend my rib cage towards my joint, right, on the proximal side. That's a terrible energy leak for a bench press. And can you imagine if all I did was use my hip flexor of the iliacus, I'd walk around like this all day, which would be a terrible stress on the spine. But what we have is a psoas muscle, and now the psoas has the same approximately connection point on the femur, but it comes through the iliopectineal notch and travels to L5, L4, L3, all the way up the spine. So now you anchor the pelvis and the lumbar spine, so when you fire a hip flexion, all of this becomes stiffened and stable. It was one of my graduate students who said, oh, it's like having a sock of wet cement. And when you activate psoas, it turns into a stiff column of cement. And another little bit of trivia, I was one of the first guys in the world to have an electrode implanted into my psoas. And, I was fairly aware and I could activate individual muscles if you asked me to. The very first time I had psoas implanted, I would try and flex my torso muscles, and we didn't get a signal. And I'd laterally bend and no signal. And all I did was flex my hip. Electrical storm. So the psoas is a hip flexor. End of story. However, what it also contributes, because of its connection all the way up the lumbar spine to the diaphragm, is stiffness and stability. The brain in some people facilitates activation of psoas. So because of pain or because they've been sitting too long. And when they get out of the chair, the telltale sign is they shoot their hip up with hamstrings, and then they walk their hands up. And it takes quite a period of time for them to pull their hips through. That's usually a psoas. And then they'll do a hip flexor stretch. They'll do a lunge like this, or go down onto a knee and do some kind of hip flexion stretch. And they never make any headway because they are not they're not targeting psoas. But I've described the architecture. Psoas connects to the femur and comes all the way up the lumbar spine. So to isolate psoas, if you could palpate, there's the inguinal crease between my torso and my femur. There's the crease. If I palpate the high middle quad, which is quadratus lumborum, now I'm going to drift my fingers medially into the notch. That's the iliopectineal notch. So I'm going to get right on, dig deep. Now I'm on psoas tendon. I can do a lunge and I don't feel any tension whatsoever. I feel tension in iliacus and rectus femoris, but not psoas. And it's not until I'm just going to, sorry, I can't get full height here, but what I'm going to do now is I'm going to do the lunge, but if I push my hand high up over my head, for the first time now, I just stretch psoas as the target. Now I'm going to drop my shoulder back just a little bit and rotate. Whoa, now I've really got psoas. Now, we can have this discussion at a grade school level, or I can take you to the PhD level if you like. Do you want to go there?
Let's get some.
Yeah, continue. Yeah, that's great.
Okay, so have you heard of a fella named Thomas Myers on Anatomy Trains?
I have not.
Name sounds
okay,
familiar, but
so Tom Meyer has done these magnificent dissections of the fascia through the body and how they create different slings and connections through the body. There is a connection from psoas up through the diaphragm, across the pec and into the arm. Well, is this true functionally? And again, I go right back to the bracketing approach to see if in this particular athlete, so if you're a 100-mile-an-hour fastballer or 110-mile-an-hour fastball in your Major League Baseball, I can guarantee you have a good fascial connection, because if you didn't, you wouldn't have the brilliance to throw the ball. You can look really quite unimpressive. But if you have that fascial connection, you have a chance to load the spring across the hip, the spring across the shoulders, and that spring, you can throw 110, but you have to have this fascial connection. So now I'll just show you my upper body. I'm palpating my psoas. For those people, when you push the heel towards the ceiling and you spin the hand around, whoa, there is psoas tightening under my fingers down here on the psoas tendon, and now it's released. So I'm spinning through the shoulder, the fascia. Are you getting it, Ensima?
Yeah.
You have to.
Yeah, I feel
is your right hand on the left psoas?
My right hand is on the right psoas. So I should put my right hand on the
wrong one. So this is like a Simon Says thing. If you were to stand up and do a lunge with your left leg back, right leg forward, right hand goes across to your left psoas. So feel the high quad drift medially into the iliopectineal notch, and you'll be right on the tendon.
Yep.
Okay. Now, you can widen your lunge and you will feel hip flexor stress, but it is not psoas. Now, put your left arm over your head and push your fingers to the ceiling quite strictly. Now, did you feel anything coming on under your right fingers in the psoas tendon?
Not yet.
Drop your left shoulder back just a little bit. Drop it and rotate around with it. Allow your torso to rotate with your left shoulder going back.
Oh, yeah.
Now lean to, there you go.
Yeah.
Now push the heel of your hand to the ceiling and externally rotate around. Is that changing the perception of psoas under your fingers?
Yeah.
Okay, so you have a fascial connection now. So
Ooh-wee.
if
That felt awesome.
Oh, well, it's you know,
great.
This, I compare this. So if you're a jujitsu man, and Seema, I'm not going to pick on jujitsu. I'll pick on any sport. It never ends, does it?
Nope.
You know, I'm mid-60s, and I'm still learning the mastery of the craft of different sports and how to tune the F1 race car. It never ends, and it's a beautiful. I don't know if I should use the word pastime. It's much more than a pastime. It's a total commitment. But nonetheless, isn't it magical that there's, you know, something for you to start playing with now, and you have to decide, do you need to tighten that, or do you need to release it to unleash so that you're number one instead of number three or whatever?